Well, good morning, everybody, and I'd like to thank the organisers for extending an invitation for me to speak today. And it's my great pleasure to talk to you about the records that we hold in the Public Record Office of Victoria, the archives of the State Government of Victoria, that we hold with respect to the First World War. Now, with apologies to those people who served in the Navy and anyone who has relatives to soldiers who fought in the true Eastern Front, I call this paper the Third Front because, first of all, I had to give it a snappy title, but I thought it encompassed the three sort of areas about the war in which the great majority of Victorians would have been involved with anyway, and that is Gallipoli and the Western Front. But of course, where we're really strong about in terms of records is records relating to the home front. And the way I see it, from looking at our collection, we can probably mark it down into 3 points. One is Victoria's contribution to the war effort. Secondly, the commemoration of the war debt and events that occurred during that war. And because I'm talking about the Third Front Victoria and beyond, the soldier settlement scheme, which is the great focus of the talk. But first, we'll talk about those two other areas. And one of the things that people don't often realise about PROV is that we have a very strong selection of photographic records. And these are records created by various Victorian government departments or statutory authorities. And you'd be surprised what you would find in them if you are prepared to dig. And you have to realise that in most instances, these photos are being taken by organisations for their own administrative purposes. And yet, what you can find sometimes is quite remarkable. For example, not many people realise this, but the very first shot of World War I was supposedly fired in Port Phillip Bay, at Port Phillip Heads, when the battery at Queenscliff fired a shot across the bows of a German ship called the, I don't even know how to pronounce that, the PFALZ. And this is a relatively rare photograph of that particular vessel after it had been brought back to Hobson's Bay. It was subsequently converted into an Australian vessel where it served out the rest of the war. But that is in a photographic collection from the Melbourne Harbour Trust. This comes from the records of the Victorian Railways, and it shows giant wheat stacks at Brooklyn, where wheat was bound for overseas, was just accumulating and accumulating and accumulating in ways that it hadn't done during the war. And this is in Brooklyn, but I do know from my own studies that if you took a train trip from Flinders Street Station to Williamstown at around the same time, once you left Spotswood Station, the only thing that you would see if you looked out of your window on either side were in fact these wheat stacks with corrugated iron on top and railway sleepers on top of that. The only thing that would have been different would have been the railway stations themselves before you got to the Williamstown Pier station. We also have this amazing set of 2 albums which is attributed to the YMCA, although we suspect it's come about because the YMCA donated these to a Victorian government body, which are photographic albums of World War I artwork and images. And the YMCA apparently provided a great deal of support to the soldiers on the front lines, or to be more specific, behind the front lines. And what these are sketchings of some of the work that they did. So this, for example, shows you a kitchen set up permanently behind the lines. Oops, that's out of sequence. They also provided entertainment. So they would set up these gigantic circus tents. And here is a setup of a casualty clearing station. You can see the name of the German location down the bottom there. So I suspect that this would be an Australian equivalent of a MASH unit. And we'll go back one. And then, of course, there were always recruitment actions going on during the war, and where the railways really came to the party there was in dressing up various trains as recruiting trains. And this one is taken from December of 1914 at Echuca Station, so they clearly covered the length and breadth of the entire state. The Education Department was very involved in the raising of funds to support the war effort. And one of the more famous examples is the efforts that the children of Victoria did to raise funds to help in the reconstruction of Villers-Bretonneux. And we have a collection of photographs that's been brought to our collection that came from the former Education History Unit, which contains a number of photographs, mostly of the Villers-Bretonneux site, but there are a handful of photos. This one shows you at the Lake Bolac School, and they even included photographs of the opening ceremony where the school, I think it was, that was built as a result of the funds that had been raised. And this is in 1923 with the first stone being laid. Of course, we have lots of other records which we can also talk about. If you have a look at the records of just about any council for which we have correspondence files or council committee minutes from that period of time, you will probably find that councils had set up patriotic committees or fundraising activities, and what they did would have been documented in council files or in those committee minutes. If there are a handful of registers from some of the local courts that show action taken with respect to manpower, particularly in country areas. And there are also lots of departmental files, even talking about the ways that departments responded to particular aspects of the war and other activities. I can remember looking in the correspondence files of the Premier's Department, for example, and found a file in that in which the government had sent a letter of condolence to the family of Mr. Jacker, who had received the VC after he'd been killed in battle. But let's talk about commemoration. And the way that I see it, we have records that allow you to see what steps government bodies took to recognise their war dead. If you also look at the council records, you can see how after the war, lots of councils set up monument committees to oversee the construction of war memorials or whatever. Some departments even went so far as to publish volumes which at a stroke, brings together orderly soldiers who died on the front, and the one thing that they had in common was that they worked for that particular department. I think the SEC, not the SEC, they didn't exist at that point. I think the Melbourne Metropolitan Board of Works was one example, and so was the Education Department. And of course, there's a big legacy that we have in that building at the end of St Kilda Road, the Shrine of Remembrance, where we have the Public Works Department plans relating to its design, and we also have some of the earliest records of the trust itself, which came to us from the Melbourne City Council. And here are some examples of commemorative activities. This is an ordinary photograph from the Railways Department, and the function of the photographs was to show you what particular railway stations look like at particular points in time. And this is a railway station at a place called Conacher. And the thing about this, which is quite interesting, is that there, which is described as a Great War Memorial Board of a type that I've never ever seen previously. In the correspondence of the Ballarat City Council, there is this thing called a casualty book. Now, it's not actually a book. It's a number of sheets of paper that were produced once every week and which have been bound together and have been folio numbered. And what it did was to set out every Sunday when the flag flew at half-mast in respect to the war dead, to identify those members of the local area who in fact had died. And in fact, on this page, which is one of the early pages in this particular record, which is dated in May of 1915, is obviously the indications of the first war dead coming from Gallipoli, because you can see that the notification there is of Major General Bridges. But for the most part, it's just ordinary, everyday people who lived in that area. And the Ballarat City Council correspondence is also useful, because if you look in those correspondence, you'll also find the documentation relating to the origin of its Avenue of Honour, which of course became very influential throughout the state and indeed all of Australia. And then there is the shrine. This is a cross-section of one of a number of the drawings we have of the shrine, but the thing that I love the most about this is this particular one, which is all related to the shaft of light that comes down on the 11th. And so you can see there some of the calculations that went on, and which is also with the angles and things that have been built in to the same plan. Very impressive stuff. But really, the thing that most people want to hear about is the area where we have, in which we are the most strongest in our collection, and that's in relation to the soldier settlement scheme that followed the First World War. Now, I have been very ill over the last month or so. Before that, I had started to really delve into these records to truly understand them, and it had started to yield up its secrets to me. I'm not yet in a position to start sharing what I begun to understand, mainly because the illness has gotten away. So a lot of my comments now are going to come from a very detailed volume relating, which is called the Lands Guide, which is a detailed explanation and guide to the records we have of the Department of Crown Lands and Survey. And if you want to follow through on a lot of my comments today, then you can have a look at that. It's available in the reading room, and you can also purchase it. Soldier settlement represented the efforts of the government to deal with thousands of returned World War I soldiers in a manner that expressed the nation's gratitude for their sacrifices while satisfying the aim of closest settlement. The Discharged Soldiers Settlement Act of 1917 provided for settlement of returned soldiers under the same general conditions as closest settlement, but with some more generous concessions that sought to ensure, that is justified in the 1925 report of the Royal Commission on Soldier Settlement, that the lack of capital was to be no bar to a soldier's chance of getting land should he prove himself otherwise suitable. Now, the Closer Settlement Board administered the scheme in the dry or non-irrigable areas, and from 1933 onwards by the Closer Settlement Commission. The wet or irrigable areas were dealt with by the State Rivers and Water Supply Commission. By 1938, almost 2.5 million acres of land had been taken up by soldier settlers, compared with 1.4 million acres for civilian closer settlement schemes, and almost one quarter of it was Crown land. Due to a number of factors, including the lack of capital and inexperience on the part of many soldiers, and the quality and the size of the land allocated, soldier settlement was generally regarded as a failure, with huge financial losses borne by the government and untold hardships borne by the settlers. By 1938, more than half of all soldier settlers had left their holdings. The provisions of the Discharged Soldier Settlement Act of 1917 were absorbed into the Closer Settlement Act of 1928. So, in other words, from 1938 onwards, any soldiers who were still on the land had their soldier settlement scheme converted to become a closer settlement scheme, and the soldier settlement scheme was regarded as having been completed. To be eligible to receive a block of land, the applicant had to obtain what was called a qualification certificate from the Soldiers' Qualification Committee, established by the Minister for Lands. To obtain this, previous proof of previous farming experience had to be provided, together with a reference from the applicant's local repatriation committee and others, and the applicant had to submit to an oral examination by the committee. The qualification certificate and papers relating to them are often attached to the advances files and sometimes the closer settlement file itself, which we'll talk about later. Unfortunately, the only series in custody directly relating to this qualification committee has hardly any information in it. It is simply a listing of names and dates, and we're not even quite sure what the dates mean. I suspect it's when the oral examination took place. In some districts, land was then acquired and open specifically for soldier settlement. In others, returned soldiers and civilians mingled on closer settlement estates. In some cases, a returned soldier with a qualification certificate could obtain a farm in a district of his choice, which was then purchased on his behalf by the Closer Settlement Board. These more liberal provisions for discharged soldier settlers relating to land purchase were designed to ensure that a soldier desirous of settling on the land be given the opportunity to establish his home among his relations and old associates, and not to have to seek a selection in perhaps some remote part of the state. This entailed the purchase of lands in all parts of the country where no Crown lands were available. And the records that are listed behind me are pretty spotty, but they do outline this process. Soldier settlers applied for conditional purchase leases that had the same term as leases for closer settlement blocks, but with a few concessions. Provisions in the Closer Settlement Act also applied to soldier settlers. In addition to these, specific terms and conditions relating to soldier settlers were contained in the Soldier Settlers Act, Settlement Acts. The difference between a lease held by a soldier settler and a lease held by a closer settler is shown in the file number through the inclusion of a suffix, as we will explain in a minute. No person was to hold more than one conditional purchase lease. A lengthy list of conditions set out in Section 49 of the Closer Settlement Act of 1904, later Section 86 of the Closer Settlement Act of 1915, was part of the lease for farm allotments. These included compulsory residence requirements, fencing requirements, the destruction of vermin and noxious weeds, the making of substantial improvements to a specified value, subject to inspection and certification by the board, and prohibited the transfer or mortgage of the land during the first 6 years of its alienation or purchase from the Crown. Instalments of the purchase price were to be paid half yearly with fines for late payments. The first instalment accompanying the application was refundable if the application was unsuccessful. Interest was to be paid on the purchase price with payments in 63 equal instalments or otherwise as negotiated with the board. After 12 years, if all the conditions have been met and the full purchase price paid, application could be made for a Crown grant. Then the records of applicants and holders are limited, and some of those are identified in the Lands Guide, but these don't prevent people from readily being able to identify land files, fortunately. Settlers under the Discharged Soldier Settlement Scheme could have two files created. The first is a land file, which documents the leasing process, and the second, an advances file, related to any advances which the settler received from the government. In general, except for a very, very, very tiny number of files that are found in other series, a PROV All of the files relating to discharged soldier settlement are held in VPRS 5714. The advances files, though, are held in a number of different series which are arranged according to a land division, and I'll talk about that later. Let's talk about file numbers. File numbers are expressed, like all land selection file numbers throughout this time, as a fraction, where the top number equals a file number issued under the bottom number, which is the section of a particular act. These are, if you look at a parish plan, are the magic bottom numbers that you need to look for to find a soldier settlement file. They would be 86.6, which means an application made under Section 86 of the Closer Settlement Act 1915, 113.206, that's under Section 113 of the Closer Settlement Act of 1928, or 12. Of course, a lot of the ones under 12 will be not just soldier settlement acts, but they will also be closer settlement files as well. Oh, hang on, wrong way. And this is what I mean by the file number being expressed like a fraction. There's your 86.6 number, and there's your top number. So the 3,748th application under that section of the Act. And just for reference, this is the file cover of the land selection file for one of the more famous of the files that we do have. It's the file for Percy Pepper, one of the very few, if not the only, Aboriginal returned soldier to have actually received a soldier settlement block. And those people who want to read more about the Percy Pepper story can have a look at our online publication, Footprints. In terms of the contents of a soldier settlement file, you can expect to find an application form, reports from the inspectors of land settlement, documentation between the settler and the agency, which would include letters written, obviously, by the discharged soldier, a Crown grant, if it was made, and if you're fortunate, the qualification certificate and associated documents. Now, to find a file number, ideally, you should know the name of the parish in which the land is located, and even better, the allotment and section number. You can find these numbers in a variety of ways. First of all, through our online parish plans, the series number is there. From the advances file, many of those in our online catalogue are identified by surname, so they might be a bit easier to find. But more importantly, and the easiest way to find it, is through the microfiche series in our reading rooms, VPRS 7311 and VPRS 7312, which identifies every single file within VPRS 5714. The good news is that as time is going on, PROV has been has taken all of that data from the microfiche series, we've converted it into electronic form, and we're now putting that into our online listings, and we're getting the marvellous volunteers who do great work at PROV to supplement that by starting to add the names of the soldiers in that list detail. Now, we haven't started that on the discharged soldiers yet, but at some point in the future we will get to that. And we'll talk about the advances files. The Discharged Soldier Settlement Acts and the Closer Settlement Acts allowed for the granting of advances to settlers in money or in kind to allow for the erection of buildings and fencing, the purchase of implements and stocks, and for other defined purposes. The amount that could be obtained and the terms of repayment were set out in the Acts with the Board or Commission able to take a lien or mortgage or other security to ensure repayment of the advance. Where repayment did not occur, the Board could foreclose or take some action as a penalty, which is what happened to a hell of a lot of people. To identify an advance number, you have to understand that the file number is going to be different to that for the closer settlement leasing number. It will usually be a single number with a prefix DSL, standing for Discharged Soldier Lease, and these were created for each for each soldier who had made application for a particular block, but they were created for each land division. And the really odd thing about this is the only time I've come across land divisions in a land environment has been in this area, and a land division seems to be nothing more than an accumulation of a number of land districts that have just been brought together for the purposes of convenience in this instance. You might be also able to get the advances file if you find the closest settlement leases file, and of course vice versa also applies. Some of the advances series that we hold have been, and they are listed there, are on our website in detailed listings, and the ones that I've got with one asterisk after the series number tells you that there are a detailed list including the soldier's name online already. The other ones, there is a alphabetical range for each box. So you might be able to use that to zero into what you want. For many discharged soldiers, settlement involved a high level of indebtedness, with most having to take advantage of the legislative provisions for advances. A Royal Commission and other inquiries in the 1920s and 30s resulted in schemes for easing terms, adjusting instalments, reducing debts and revaluing holdings. However, by 1932, the majority of settlers under soldier settlement and closest settlement were insolvent, due largely to the economic conditions of the time. Despite adjustments made to their liabilities, the position could not be rectified until Section 32 of the Closest Settlement Act 1932 came in operation in 1937. This allowed the Closest Settlement Commission to value the land and improvements, except for those made at the settler's own expense, and then to write off the deficiency between the valuation and the settler's liabilities to the Commission. The power to review the settler's ability to repay advances for other than improvements and to write off any amount deemed appropriate was also given to the Commission. Nevertheless, despite all of these concessions, there were many settlers who had no prospects of paying their instalments. In such cases, leases could be cancelled and assets realised. Land could then be assigned to another settler, but it could also be made available for sale by auction, by tender, or private negotiation. And in terms of records in relation to that, you can see that there were some series identified there for the realisation of assets. There were summary records relating to this debt adjustment process. And there's a small number of records that show settlers' accounts in particular areas. And the last series there indicates lands being sold after the lease has been cancelled. And by the way, if you look at the Victorian Government Gazette, whenever a soldier settlement lease was cancelled, that was subject to a notice in the Victorian Government Gazette. There is one complicating factor in trying to find a soldier settlement file, and that is if the person you were looking for walked off the land and their lease got transferred to somebody else, because what then happened was that the file retained its same number and the name becomes different. So it becomes very important that you know the parish section and allotment and section details. And the rest of this talk is I'm going to show you examples of what you can find on the files and how this particular problem comes about. And by doing this, we're going to tell the story, well, you can read the story in the Lands Guide about a returned soldier by the name of Keith Conacher. His military file is at the NIA. He served in both World Wars, so it's in a World War II sequence, despite the fact that he was also a World War I soldier. And it's a good case to follow through because we have both the lease file and we have the advances file under his name. But more importantly, because the file was transferred, His name and his file number doesn't appear on the parish maps, certainly not on the ones online. So in order to be able to track this file down, you need to know that it is in the parish of Indira, that it's allotment 21 and section, well, that shouldn't be section 8, that should be section A. That's a typo. This is the file cover to that file, and as you can see, Conacher's name is nowhere to appear on that file cover, and that's because after he walked off the land, the lease was transferred to another person. It was then transferred to somebody else. It then eventually ended up with a bloke by the name of Eric Baker, who by this stage was just an ordinary closest settlement selector who had no connection to army service whatsoever, and he was the one that met all of the requirements, and he was the one, as you can see at the bottom there, that obtained the freehold. So he's the one that's actually gotten the grant. But this file started by being owned by somebody else, but that person had died, and Conacher wanted to find a property in that area. And so the first thing, of course, he needed to have was this certificate of qualification that we spoke about earlier. Here's some of the documentation relating to that process. On the file itself, you'll also find handwritten statements from him, as well as, what do you call those, references from lots of other people who have known him. Couldn't see much in the way that proved that he was a bit of a farmer, by the way. There's his application for the qualification certificate. And here we start to get documentation relating to the process of the commission acquiring the land from the previous owner so that it could in turn be leased to Conacher. Then on top of that, Conacher then applies for his conditional purchase lease. And this is my rather arty-farty photo to try and show you the lease and the thing as you find it in the file, because there were very oddly shaped items on the file. And this is what happened to this poor gentleman, as you can see, in his handwriting, and I'm going to try and read it. I beg to report that in the above mentioned lease, leasee has notified me of his intention to abandon his farm. Leasee recently has his home destroyed by fire, and this with the fact that he previously experienced some hard luck has disheartened him, and he has therefore decided to give up farming. The amount of £450 has been recommended for construction of building, but as the house is really too expensive for the farm, I now suggest that we erect a cheaper one. I recommend that lease be cancelled and that farm be made available under conditions and so on. So it wasn't his letter. But that's what the ultimate fate of that property. So he was only on that land for a period of about 3 or 4 years at best. And in fact, as you can see, even the documentation has been put out on the file to provide for the Government Gazette notice. And as you can see, the reason given, financial difficulties, council make us available under the closest settlement scheme. So that file becomes a closest settlement file and it bears no relationship to soldier settlement. And that's the last bit of documentation on the file relating to Conacher. And then the rest of the file, which is about 60, 65%, 70%, relates to the subsequent history. And here's the advances file, which also isn't under his name, it's under the name of the person who took it over as a closest settlement lease. And this, says me, is the one in his own hand, where he's asking for funds from the government, an advance from the government, to be able to set himself up on that property. And here you go. This is what he got. 4 draft horses, 8 cows, 2 bovine, 2 sow pigs, anyway, some ploughs, some burrows, etc., etc. It wasn't the only advance that he made, and that immediately put him into £220 worth of debt. And then, this is the really good part, he asked for an advance so that he could build a house on the property. And you can see what it cost him. It was £360 worth. This is the house that got destroyed by fire. But for people who were trying to research this, there was a great surprise on this, because you could work out what it cost for it. You could see all of the invoices that came in, so you could even tell how many nails he purchased to build it and whatever. But what he attached to this request was this. Floor pan for the house, and as you can see, pretty big rooms for a place on the farm in those days. And if you wanted to know what it was going to look like, so it's no real surprise, I think, that once it burnt down, that was really going to be the straw that broke the camel's back. And yet, just before he decided to give it up, it had been inspected upon, and as you can see at the bottom there, leases prospects good. And yet, that's because on the basis of having all of this stock on hand, but all of it, of course, he had actually purchased through an advance. And this is obviously pointing out the demise of the farm. And so I think that brings an end to that. I think in some cases, I'm not sure how typical that particular case is of that, but it does give you a very clear indication of the wealth of information that can be found if you decide to delve into this particular area. So thank you very much.